Hello and welcome. I'm Ned Foley, and I direct the election law program here at The Ohio State University. And we are delighted that all of you can be with us today for this panel discussion so close to Election Day next Tuesday. I'm going to turn this over immediately to our Deputy Director, Steve Huffner, who will moderate this afternoon's discussion. And I've instructed Steve to keep me in particular on a short leash because I could say a lot today, but I want to hear from all of our panelists, as I know all of you do. So with that, Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Ned. It is my pleasure to be moderating today, and we have a truly distinguished group of panelists from around the country who are now turning their cameras on as well. And in just a minute, I will introduce each of them and invite them to make an opening comment. But before we hear from our panelists, because elections are all about engagement and public participation, we want to invite all of you to participate with us in a very quick poll. We have 4 questions for you to respond to, and your responses will be completely anonymous, but we invite you now to take a look at this poll, these 4 questions, and just as quickly as you can, give us your responses, and we'll then see where we are as a group at this moment. I can see that about a third of you have already voted, but I will give everyone just a few more moments to see if we can get that participation rate higher.
We like high turnout in our elections, don't we?
That's right. So now we're at 75%. Perhaps I can go ahead and give you some preliminaries here. It looks to me like not quite 2/3 of you are from the Eastern time zone of the United States. Just under 20% are in Pacific time. 2% are outside the US. As for the question of how you plan to vote, 40% are planning to use a drop-off of a mail-in ballot, 22% mailing in using the post office, 27% voting in person, and 27% early in person, 7% on election day. And then there are a few of you who are not eligible to vote. Now, in terms of the questions that might be sort of most connected to the things we're likely to talk about today, we have 25% who are choosing the option that says you think that the winner of the presidential election will be known by the day after Election Day, Wednesday, November 4th. And then we have the plurality winner here is that by the end of the week, by Friday, November 6th. But we still have almost a quarter of you who think it might be not until Thanksgiving that we know. And then to get a little more discouraging, 11% who think it might not be until December 14th when the presidential electors are required to meet in their states and cast their state votes. And then 4%, maybe not until January 6th when Congress meets in joint session to count those votes. And 2%, maybe not until Inauguration Day. We may have opportunity to talk a little more about those possibilities and what they each mean. And then the last question, how likely do you think the outcome of this year's presidential election will come down to the Supreme Court's consideration of it? 8% very likely, 35% somewhat likely, 32% somewhat unlikely. That's pretty close results there. 19% very unlikely, and 7% no idea. So that does tee up for us both a sense of some of the anxiety that is percolating around this election. I mean, both that third and fourth question, I think, give us a reminder of the ways in which there is an additional sort of uncertainty and nervousness around this election, and of some things that we might choose to talk about in the time that we have today. Now, our time is a little limited, so I'm just going to make very brief introductions of our panelists, and I'm going to invite each of them as I introduce them to just tell us what it is that at this moment they are most thinking about as they contemplate where we are and what is still ahead of us in this election season. And I'm going to do this in reverse alphabetical order. So our first contributor today is Franita Tolson. Franita is the Vice Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs, as well as Professor of Law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. Franita, it's great to see you again. What are you thinking?
First, let me thank you and Ned for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. 5 days out, what am I thinking about? So I've been thinking a lot about the recent Supreme Court orders and just in a sense of trying to figure out what it portends for post-election counting. And in particular, I think I have some concerns around some of the language in Justice Kavanaugh's opinion, where he really puts an emphasis on an election day finish. And to me, one of the reasons why it's alarming in part, and I know we're going to talk about this, so I'm not going to go on too long, but it seems to me that we've spent months, both, legal people, political scientists, all of us sort of, the cautionary tale is we have to be patient. There are a lot of people voting by mail. And, it's one thing when politicians sort of take the position that things need to conclude on election day, but it's another when a Supreme Court justice does it. And to me, that is slightly more alarming than when we have politicians make that point. And so it really increased my anxiety about what election day and beyond will look like, because I do think there will be some politicians who latch on to that language in order to try to stop the counting in some places. But also, I couple that with language in Justice Alito's opinion that came out yesterday, where he seemed to be open to revisiting the issue of these ballot deadline issues after election day. And so I think those two things together really increased my anxiety, probably tenfold in the last couple of days. And let me just stop there, but I want to make one more point. I'm really happy that this is a group where we have law people, we have political scientists, we have people of all different backgrounds, because the political scientists are really good for telling the law people to calm down. And so I welcome that today, because I am not calm. All right, thank you.
Franita, that's a perfect segue for Charles Stewart, who is the next panelist. Charles Stewart is the Keenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT, where he also co-directs the MIT Caltech Voting Technology Project and the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. Charles, what are you thinking about? You're in mute.
And I'm always that guy. I apologize. And as if on cue from Franita, since I've been tweeting about self-care and taking long walks on election day and all those things, what am I thinking about? Well, actually, the one thing I'm trying to think about as an analyst of this is actually not to have my anxiety over the state of politics intervene in how I'm thinking about this. And with that in mind, I guess I'd offer up two things. One, it feels like the American electorate has listened to the entreaties to flatten the ballot curve. It's actually quite stunning, to the point, for instance, we're observing right now a crashing in many states of the delivery of mail ballots, having seen a tsunami early in the period. And so it might very well have been that, and apropos what Franita was also saying, that voters listened to what they were being asked to do and have done it. And then this relates to, it's kind of is related to something else, which has to do with the pace of counting after Election Day. I've written a lot about this. I've talked to a lot of people about this. I'm doing this constantly right now. And it's still, I mean, I think there's still a lot to be said, or a lot to be imagined what's going to happen Tuesday night and on Wednesday. I'm still standing by the view that we're going to know a whole lot more than people think we will on Tuesday night. I also think that we need to imagine that what knowing on Tuesday night is going to mean will be different than in the past. and that we as voters, academics, and others, citizens will still need to be more nuanced, sophisticated consumers of the information that's going to be flowing our way on Tuesday night. Nonetheless, it's going to come faster than I think many of us are imagining. So,
Great. Thank you, Charles. Next is Richard Pildas, who is the Sudler Family Professor of Constitutional Law at New York University School of Law. Your brief introductory comment.
So this is not probably my top concern, but I think it's one of my top 5 concerns, and I assume others are going to speak to Pennsylvania and some of my other concerns. So this is what I wanted to put on the table. I'm concerned about voters with their smartphones and their Twitter accounts and their Instagram accounts and social media, and I'm concerned about the media. It's almost inevitable we are going to have some problems that arise on election day. We do have it in almost every election. But right now, it's easy to imagine these problems being blown vastly out of proportion. There may be serious problems, and if there are, of course, they need to be discussed and analyzed. But not having the facts before people start convincing each other of what's going on, taking small incidents a few places and making it seem as if they are major incidents going on many places has a number of pernicious effects. For one thing, low propensity voters get turned off from continuing to stay in line and vote or even to show up to vote, number one. Number two, it feeds a sense of chaos and confusion, which opens up paths to challenges to the process. It feeds a sense of illegitimacy about the election, which those who lose will grab onto after the fact. And so I think among all the things that we have to focus on, this is one that we have not discussed very much, but I think could actually be a very, very important thing to keep in mind on election day and election night.
Great. Thanks, Rick. Nathaniel Pursley is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, where he also has appointments in some other departments, including the Political Science Department. So he brings both of those backgrounds to us today. Nate?
Thank you, and thank you to the folks at Ohio State for organizing this. So let me just start by celebrating where we are, and this is a little bit what Charles was saying, which is that we've had over 80 million people who've already cast ballots, right? And there have not been major incidences yet. Certainly there's, issues of long lines in certain places, and we have, problems with mail balloting, sporadic, but there haven't been systematic problems, which if you turn back the clock 6 or 7 months ago, you might have thought that at this stage we would be running around with our hair on fire. Instead, we have probably more than half of the ballots have now been cast. We're expecting turnout over 150 million people. Like I said, over 80 million votes have been cast already, with an expected turnout, somewhere double that. 82 million absentee or mail ballots have been sent out to people. And so while we can't uncork the champagne or run a victory lap yet, it is really important to understand how these election officials have been able to adapt to this environment with remarkable success. Having said that, what am I worried about? And so the basic thing that I'm worried about is that the election is going to be close, because if the election is close, all the frailties of the election system are going to be seen as outcome determinative. And so if it does come down to absentee ballots in Philadelphia, right, we are in for a long haul here. I mean, and they could be doing a perfect job and it's not going to make a difference, both because of the sort of media the unique media system in which we're operating this election, and how people will make accusations of fraud and malfeasance and the like. And so that's what I'm concerned about, that if it does come down to one of the Midwestern battleground states, that I don't think we as a nation are prepared for a Bush versus Gore style settlement of this election like we were 20 years ago. There are plenty of other problems that that we've been thinking about, and Charles and I have started this Stanford MIT Healthy Elections project, where we've tried to investigate all the potential issues with the election infrastructure, everything from what happens when voters don't wear masks to issues of provisional ballots, which I think is a bit of a sleeper issue in this election that we haven't talked a lot about, as well as questions of violence and intimidation and the like, which I'd say are are potentially severe, but low probability. Right now, as you know, in West Philly, there's been some violent clashes that could spill over onto Election Day. But the main message I want to send is that we are doing extremely well right now, especially if you benchmark it against the primaries that began this whole process of adaptation of the election infrastructure to the COVID environment.
Thank you. Derek Muller is professor of law at the University of Iowa College of Law. Derek, what are you thinking about?
Thanks for having me. I'm thinking about Pennsylvania, but I don't want to just stick with Pennsylvania. So the thing on my mind, and Minnesota has helped me think about it more in the last 24 hours, is both Pennsylvania and Minnesota have reached this sort of settlement to hold off pending litigation, to say there's going to be challenges to some ballots that we receive after Election Day due to ongoing litigation about those issues, including in Pennsylvania, ballots that may lack a postmark that are received after Election Day. And it's sort of a temporary measure. We're going to sort of segregate those ballots and hold them off and deal with them later. And I totally understand why that's happening. If you commingle all the ballots and just keep counting them, it's impossible to unring that bell. And yet at the same time, you are sort of creating stacks of ballots specifically to litigate over in the event that it is an extremely close election. And that's not a recount question, it's whether or not to even count them in the first place. So I'm a little nervous about this notion of building up sort of in closets somewhere, stacking ballots for the parties to potentially fight about later. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure if it's going to fall upon traditional partisan lines, because I think it might also depend on who's ahead on election night. And it's not even necessarily something that affects the presidential election. It could affect the congressional election somewhere in those states or elsewhere. So that's the thing I've been thinking about too.
Thanks, Derek. Lisa Mannheim is the Charles I. Stone Associate Professor of Law at the University of Washington School of Law. Lisa, what's your top of mind concern at the moment?
Thanks. So I would say with respect to what a couple other people have already said, I also have concerns about people using, whether deliberately or inadvertently, using normal election imperfections to call into question election results. But because that's been flagged by a couple people already, I will turn to something that's related, but I think is distinct, which is the threats posed by deliberate disinformation. So you might think of disinformation as intentional efforts by bad actors to do, in this context, among other things, to suppress turnout and then also to undermine confidence in the election results. And right now, it's I think pretty clear from many different perspectives that we are very vulnerable as a society to disinformation right now. And unfortunately, we also know that there are a number of actors who are trying to take advantage of that vulnerability. Some of the actors are foreign, some of them are domestic. And in a sense, this isn't really a legal issue I'm talking about, but it's relevant to law because while the law can answer a lot of questions in the context of elections and in the context of disputed elections, at a certain point, the law cannot overcome a society's inability to separate fact from fiction. So just sort of two examples of how this could theoretically play out. So on the front end, so we already have disinformation coming out that is having at least the intention, if not the effect, of suppressing votes. Other examples, what if as we get closer to Election Day, suddenly there starts being sort of a concerted effort on different platforms to suggest that there's violence at the polls in an effort to convince people not to come. That is totally illegal. The law is very clear that you cannot do that. However, there's not really a legal remedy that goes to the election. The law might say that these people can go to jail if they can be subject to process, but it's not like the election is rerun if a number of people don't end up showing up at the polls. So that's on the front end. One example of how this could play out in the back end, if you have something like sort of fake reports of massive voter fraud and the like. Again, this as a matter of law, this is, if we're positing that it's false, then this is wrong as a matter of law. It should not be taken into consideration with respect to how to figure out the answer to the election. And courts, at least in theory, should be able to suss that out. The courts are designed to separate fact from fiction, but that takes time. And so to the extent that there's a pressure to get that out quickly, to have those factual issues resolved quickly, that's not something that courts are particularly good at. This all being said, thankfully, disinformation in this election is sort of a known unknown. And while it's easy to sort of criticize media in different ways, what I would say from my perspective, I'm seeing a lot of effort by reporters and others in the media to try to figure this stuff out and to get on top of it and to take precautions going forward. So that's really great to see that sort of work.
Right. Richard Hassan is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. Rick, what are you thinking about?
Well, thanks for including me in this discussion. Obviously, at the top of my list are the low probability, highly catastrophic events that could happen. Among the other things that have not been mentioned, something like a cyber attack on election day. And we've seen already attacks on election infrastructure in this election season. But since others have talked about that, let me just say, since the prompt is not what's worrying you about election day, but just reflections on where we are, that I'm profoundly disappointed that we have not come together as a country to agree to make it as easy as possible for people to vote during a pandemic. I think Nate is right that through a tremendous amount of effort, we have pretty good turnout so far, and people have made Herculean efforts to make sure that polling places will be open so that people can vote in person. But we have a fragmented and polarized election system. We have, according to the tracker at Nate and Charles' website, Healthy Elections, I think now over 400 pieces of litigation involving our election. You have the Republican Party that is trying to make it harder for people to register and vote. There were stories in both Politico and in the New York Times this morning about the only strategy that Trump has right now is to try to either throw the election to chaos in Pennsylvania or make claims of fraud to try to litigate it if the election comes down to Pennsylvania. And I just think that if you look at other countries that have held elections during the pandemic, you look at a place like South Korea, you look at other countries, what you see is they do not have this constant fighting. They have national nonpartisan election administrators who run elections fairly and safely. And just think of how much more energy we would be able to put into actually deciding who would be the best candidates if we were not fighting in the middle of a pandemic over very basic voting rights, where the people who often have their voting rights undermined, including younger voters, minority voters, older voters, people who've moved, having even more difficulty registering to vote, and it was completely unnecessary. We could have had a national strategy that could have made this much less of a legal and political struggle.
Thanks, Rick. Rebecca Greene is Professor of the Practice of Law and Kelly Professor of Excellence in Teaching at the William and Mary Law School, where she also is co-director of their election law program. Rebecca?
Great. Thanks so much for hosting this event and for including me in it. So at the top of my mind these days is transparency. Transparency plays a vital role in our elections in ensuring public confidence in outcomes. And there are huge challenges to ensuring transparency this year. Like, will enough poll observers step forward to serve this important function, including after Election Day, if that becomes necessary? How can election observers perform their role safely in a pandemic and effectively? And then there's, of course, the problem of the president literally weaponizing transparency by using militaristic terms for encouraging his supporters to observe at polling places. And, all of this is happening in an election where I think transparency is an especially important value given the level of mistrust in our political system. So I guess to that end, I hope, I know that election officials are dedicated to ensuring that, that our election is as open and transparent as possible. And I hope that before and on and even after November 3rd, that they continue to find creative ways to ensure transparency amidst pandemic conditions. And I just sort of worry how that's all gonna, how that's all gonna unfold.
Thanks, Rebecca. And so then let me introduce Edward Foley. Ned is the Charles W. Ebersold and Florence Whitcomb Ebersold Chair in Constitutional Law here at Ohio State, where he's my colleague and is the director of our election law program. Ned, what are you thinking about?
Well, I just want to quickly echo what some other folks have said about the problem of perception, because the reality may be, as Charles and Nate suggest, that we're actually successful this year in having an election that meets standards of free and fair elections and gives the voters what they want, and yet no one will believe it because of disinformation or just the effort to sow doubt. So that is my top of mind concern. And in that regard, I fear that litigation is going to be used to that end, not so much to win the cases in court, but perhaps as a secondary strategy to try to win a narrative in public opinion that it's just who knows what the result is, or who knows whether the system is trustworthy. So, you know, I see the contest over the outcome is not just to find the truth, but to control the public perception of that. And just one specific version of that, I still can't figure out how the process of verifying and validating the absentee ballots are going to go in some of the battleground states, particularly Pennsylvania, how long that's going to take, what the process is going to be, how litigious it becomes. So that's a specific aspect of my concern. Thanks, Steve.
So thank you, everyone, for those initial thoughts. What we'd like to do is, for about the next 20 to 30 minutes, just build off of that and respond a little bit to each other. And then I will open it up to some of the questions from the audience, which are already coming in. And we would just not have a chance to get to all those questions. But as we now open up among the panelists that are assembled, and one of the things that was occurring to me as I listened to you, and this relates to a question that's already come in fact, is the challenge of distinguishing between what we might call the normal misfirings that occur on an election day as contrasted with something that is not normal or is more serious, as well as how to distinguish between litigation that then might flow that is serious or legitimate, perhaps, as distinguished from litigation that might be itself not legitimate, that is itself part of a misinformation campaign or a public perception manipulation effort. So I'm just curious whether some of you have some thoughts about helping the public be able to distinguish between normal election administration between now and election day or the day after and thereafter too, but versus a real problem.
I think I can jump in here. I think sometimes the problem is that it's normal election administration that often ends up being blown up into big problems, as opposed to there really being a distinction between sort of normal election administration and then things that are, you know, malfeasance or deliberate sort of tinkering with the election system. Because in many situations, we're talking about election administrators who are trying to get it right. And sometimes my sense is that you have some type of maybe mistake or incompetence or something of that nature that leads to a bigger problem. So this doesn't, of course, erase the fact that there are flaws in our system that we probably should take more seriously and try to get ahead of. But my sense is that when we have huge problems, sometimes it often stems from things that are just a part of normal election administration and something goes wrong, as opposed to anyone's, you know, starting out with the intention of creating a huge problem.
Thanks, Vanita. I know, you know, Rick, you've given a lot of thought to this kind of problem. Do you have some advice for the public about how to distinguish between regular administrative problems and serious misfirings? Rick Hassan?
I thought that was for Rick Pildas, who had made that comment earlier. What I would say is that what's really unusual about this election is that the election itself is a major election issue. And so I think the public, on the one hand, the public is going to be looking for problems because they've heard so much about the problems. But on the other hand, I think people have somewhat become inoculated against some of the more extreme statements, for example, that Trump has made. So when Trump says ballots have to, I think he said today, ballots have to be counted on election night, or Democrats are going to steal the election in Philadelphia. I mean, imagine if another presidential candidate had said that at any other time in American history. It would be, front page news for days. But now it's just kind of, oh, well, that's just Trump speaking. And so I think that there is a sense in which everyone is going to be, no one's going to believe it when they're told that things have gone well. And it's going to take some time to educate people, but everybody's coming in with so much skepticism about the election that misinformation about the election also will be treated skeptically. And so I hope that that will leave an opening for the media and social media to be responsible in telling the truth about what's going on, rather than allowing small bore problems to be blown up, as the president and others have tried to do, into claims of widespread fraud or chaos. I think, and all of us, I think, are out there in public roles, many of us speaking to journalists. I've been speaking to journalists all day, basically, for the last 3 weeks, trying to educate the public about how our elections actually work and how to take these kinds of claims with a grain of salt and what to actually expect in terms of election day counting. I should say post-election day counting.
So unless anyone has some other thought, yeah, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that question is sort of hard to answer, obviously, in a vacuum, right? So it's going to depend on what the specific issue is. That being said, just to state sort of the thing that we're all hearing over and over again that is so important, the crucial thing is to check one's source for the information in question. And one of the reasons why misinformation and disinformation are circulating so easily now is because of how easy and tempting, frankly, it is for people to circulate things on websites that have no sort of effective check on disinformation or misinformation, like Twitter and Facebook and the like. So checking one's source is really important, and knowing that often it takes time to understand what is going on is also important. You often can't get immediate information. That being said, if you take a step beyond that and want to sort of try to figure out what matters and what doesn't, I think one way of thinking about it, in a sense, is, well, what are you going to do about it? So again, the law sometimes gives us an answer to what should we do about it. So if there's some sort of dispute over the way ballots are counted, for example, then the law allows for recount proceedings. That's normal, that's baked into the law. If there's further disputes, for example, over something like fraud, the law also has a mechanism for that, which is an election contest. Now these legal answers are often not satisfying for various reasons. And this is really true in the context of a presidential election, essentially because presidential elections can't be rerun if necessary, as other elections can. And there's also a number of important deadlines that makes it really hard to do all of that legal work before we have to come up with a conclusion. And so essentially the question is, if you don't like the illegal answer, what are you going to do about it? And that's something that I think is a hard set of questions. That's hard to answer, but that's one way I think about it. Does it matter? Does it matter? Does it not matter? Well, what's at stake here? What potentially should we be doing in response?
Thanks, Lisa. So because our time is as limited as it is, I'm going to switch to a new topic. Several of you, in describing your opening concerns, made brief reference to the Pennsylvania situation. Let's spend a few minutes talking about what we think of what's happening in Pennsylvania. And that has several dimensions to it, from the unrest that has the potential to affect the election day experience, to the changes in the procedures that the state Supreme Court has required, to the US Supreme Court's involvement in reviewing that. Derek, may I start with you? You made reference to the Pennsylvania circumstance. What are you thinking about where we stand there?
Yeah, it has the makings of a perfect storm. And I remember, back in the spring or winter in one of these very Ohio State roundtables where we were using Pennsylvania as a foil, right? It's not like people didn't see this coming in some respects. I think it reflects first a frustration that the legislature and the executive have been at heads with one another for an extended time. In a lot of states, legislation has gone through to address some of these problems. Pennsylvania is a place where it hasn't worked out. I think about the difficulties in, most states are processing their ballots ahead of Election Day and Pennsylvania isn't. And a lot of counties are announcing they're not even going to start counting vote by mail things until the day after Election Day. It's a large state that's closely divided and might be a tipping point in the Electoral College. And it has a Supreme Court that's issuing decisions to the consternation of some members of the United States Supreme Court. So, I think a lot of people are hoping that maybe Pennsylvania won't matter, or maybe Pennsylvania will be decided by 5 points or more and very quickly, and we won't have to spend a lot of time fretting about it. But it's sort of it's been a disappointing sort of series of factors and sort of breakdowns that again, I think we saw coming from months out to this stage in the process that have sort of sown some of this uncertainty.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I'd be curious how all the panelists think at the moment about an issue that I've talked, I think, to each of you separately about, which is this risk that's been discussed a lot in the last few months about the possibility of the state legislature, wanting to take matters into its own hands, so to speak, with respect to the presidential election. And I know, some people, including some of my co-panelists, have been very skeptical that could happen in America, that we trust the voters to vote, and that's how we run elections. One good piece of good news is that when the legislature took a step to create this investigative committee a month or so ago, that got so much pushback that they recoiled and stopped that committee. And again, as Derek says, maybe none of this will matter if Pennsylvania doesn't matter, or if it's so overwhelming. But going to my earlier point, should we be worried more about the courts or the administrative process or the legislative process in Pennsylvania? I'd be curious what other people think on that.
All right, so that's teed up for us all to be thinking about. Charles, do you want to respond immediately to that? And I know I have both Rick Pildas and Rick Hassan waiting to talk too.
Well, I mean, actually, the first thing that I would just say, just to actually maybe to tee it up further, I mean, I think it's a commentary where if you go to the Pennsylvania Secretary of State website right now, they have a website, myths about appointing electors to the Electoral College. One myth: the Pennsylvania General Assembly will simply ignore the popular vote and choose their own electors. The answer is, Pennsylvania law is clear. Pennsylvania's electors will be awarded to the candidate who received the most votes. In fact, legislative leaders came out swiftly to reject this myth as soon as it was printed. And it goes on to kind of reassure the voters that, now, who knows whether to believe this or not, but it is striking that this at least needs to be said, in the same way that the U.S. Senate felt like it had to pass a resolution in favor of a peaceful transfer of power, which was almost, but not totally, passed unanimously. So.
Thanks,
I just
Charles.
say that if we're in that world where it's conceivable that the election has been decided by the voters and that the Pennsylvania state legislature then passes a law appointing its own electors, we are already in meltdown mode, right? So that then it's like, that is a low probability event with terrible consequences. And we can sort of jump through the hoops right now as to, well, what would happen if it goes to the Supreme Court? How would it affect the Electoral College? What would Congress do? But in this environment, none of the formal legal mechanisms would, I think, address that kind of scenario. We can hypothesize. And so that's why, I do focus on the things that will make the election, the result look clear. I think, if we are in a Bush versus Gore scenario where you've got 500 votes that are separating the candidates in one state, right? Like I said at the beginning, our political institutions and our political parties are not prepared for that kind of situation right now, right? We are just in a very different world. But the more likely consequence is that you'd have, some clear result on election day. And then, I think it'd be quite difficult for a separate slate of electors to be appointed by a legislature if it's clear what the popular vote in the state was.
Rick Pildas?
I was just going to quickly say that's the kicker, right? Is that I think that we can all agree that that's probably the case. But what happens if it isn't clear who the winner of the popular vote is, because there's a contested batch of ballots, you know, that people can't agree that's large enough that it's outcome determinative. And so I think, in that instance, I think Ned's hypothetical becomes more frightening.
Right, but we can, then the question as to whether the Pennsylvania legislature is more important than whether it's the Secretary of State or the governor or the Supreme Court. I think that, then we're in the world where of power politics, right? And I think that that's going to end up, deciding a lot of this. But it really just depends on what when I've held some symposia with the lawyers for Bush versus for the Bush team, they would always talk about how at the bottom of the CNN screen, they always had the number of votes that Bush was up by throughout the Bush versus Gore controversy. And the question is there at least firmly rooted in people's understanding of the situation that someone is significantly ahead or not? And then how does that affect the actions of the political actors?
Rick Pildas?
Yes, so a couple additional things about Pennsylvania, and to put it in context, we already have, according to public opinion polls, 25% of people on either side who, today say the only way their candidate can win is if the election is rigged. I saw one of your commentators in the question said, I haven't seen the story, so I don't know if this is true, but that Politico supposedly has a story, the only way Trump can win is if the election is rigged. Which is not true, of course. But you have people primed to believe these kinds of things. And so a sleeper issue in Pennsylvania that, to my surprise, dropped off the picture some is this whole issue of these, skinny ballots or naked ballots. We don't know how many of these ballots are going to turn out to be cast that aren't in the sleeves that you have to use to put them then in the envelope that you return. And they could be a larger number than the number of people who vote in that 3-day window. I don't know at this point. If we were within that margin and those votes are thrown out, which I find to be an absolutely bizarre policy, but a policy enacted before this election that the Democratic majority Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, which extended the ballot deadline, decided Pennsylvania law required that those ballots be thrown out. The losing side, if they lose within that margin, will be convinced that the election was stolen. And they'll have a legitimate, grievance possibly, because it is, to me, hard to understand as a matter of, public policy, but even reading the statute in Pennsylvania that that's actually required. So, I just think, as many of us know, Pennsylvania has some of the worst election policies in the country and one of the most important states in this election. In my view, the governor and the legislature both bear blame for not addressing some of the big issues that needed to be addressed there. I totally agree with what Nate said. Given what people already believe today, if the election is close and we get into any kind of Bush v. Gore, I don't mean Supreme Court, but just litigation over the outcome, I can tell you today, the losing side, half the country will just not believe the result is legitimate, period, no matter how it's resolved and with what institutions. That's the reality, in my view, of the moment we're in. So I think it's extremely unfortunate that Pennsylvania did not take care of business in the way that a lot of other states did. And I hope they don't throw the country into a terrible election nightmare.
Rick Hassan?
So I agree with what Nate and Rick said. I'm much more concerned about these issues than about the Article 2 legislator issue, which I think would provoke a huge backlash and rioting in the streets and around the country and imperil the legislators themselves. And so I think it would be hugely risky for them to do that. So that's not the top of my list. But I just want to add on to what Rick said, where he mentioned that Pennsylvania has some of the worst policies when it comes to elections. It also has some of the worst implementation when it comes to elections. Just today on my election law blog, I linked to stories about how 40,000 voters in one county never received their ballots, and there's no explanation for why they didn't come. Another story about how there's not clear guidance from the state on what to do about ballots that come in that have errors on them, and if voters should be told that they're missing a signature, because there's no formal cure procedure written into the law. There's nothing against it either. There was a story at NBC maybe a month and a half ago. You had a quarter of the state's local election administrators quitting because they couldn't handle the job given what they were dealing with. So much of what is seen as voter suppression or an attempt to rig the vote is pure incompetence. And there's just so much incompetence in Pennsylvania that it becomes, if we do get into this razor thin election, it's going to be worse than Florida because everyone's practiced in the 20 years since Florida. And there are so many more, you can conjure up just so many lawsuits about things that could be outcome determinative if you're fighting over 500 votes. That's why, for the sake of the country, it cannot come down to Pennsylvania. If it comes down to the state of Pennsylvania's electoral college votes, it better be a blowout one way or the other.
Can I give a little up, since I'm in touch with some of the Pennsylvania officials, let me give a little view from the ground here about what's good in Pennsylvania, what's happening. So there are certain challenges that they have overcome this year, which I think are significant. I do think that they've recruited enough poll workers in the main places. That was going to be a big issue, and I think that there's been some movement there. Also, I believe that while the laws, as Rick Pildas was saying, really do constrain them on various aspects of mail balloting, they have spent millions of dollars getting the equipment that they need in order to process the mail ballots. They've hired a lot of people. They've brought in some folks from the outside we've worked with to get that through. But they are dealing with it's not just archaic or difficult laws, and not even just some of the administrative problems that you're talking about there, but they have political structures in place where there are no clear lines of authority sometimes, and that's a real challenge there that prevents sort of cohesive decision making and authority over given election problems.
I think Charles might have something you wanted to say on that.
I wanted to actually underscore what Nate said at the very, very end. The New York Times had an article about the New York City Board of Elections a couple of days ago and how riven it is with partisan politics. And I was yelling at the paper asking why they didn't write about Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania, I think, is in terms of partisanship and just the organization of the county election boards and the precincts down below, is really is turtles all the way down with respect to just how thoroughly partisanship has been embedded in election administration through the Constitution of Pennsylvania. And as Nate said, it makes it very difficult for any sort of central guidance, for accountability to best practices and all of the rest. And so I am hoping that in Pennsylvania and a couple of other states, New York, Missouri, maybe some of the others, that this issue of partisan election administration, which exists in a pure form in a few places, can be revisited.
Of course, one of the administrative issues in Pennsylvania is whether ballots that arrive after Election Day, and that's what went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And there are some questions coming in, question and answer feature, raising curiosities about that. And I just want to at least clarify one of those and ask whether people are seeing this the same way. Somebody wanted reassurance that parties could not go back to the Supreme Court in a sort of Trump versus Biden repeat of Bush versus Gore that would cause the Supreme Court to halt counting of ballots that hadn't been received by Election Day. And of course, there have been moments when President Trump has said all the counting should be done by Election Day. So, the question that hangs out there is, given the current state of the law, will ballots that have been marked by election day but arrive after election day still be counted?
Probably.
If
You know, the one, I mean, that's why they're segregating the ballots, right? In the event that there's some dispute over this, but if they're received within 3 days after the election, all likelihood is that yes, they will be counted. But as with everything in this election season, you know, if you're a voter, vote early, and right now you deliver it by hand to the election offices, so or to the ballot drop boxes. I think, look, what the Supreme Court yesterday did, right, was it denied a motion for expedited consideration, cert petition, right? And so that there is the possibility that they could have said, well, you know, because of their inability to decide the earlier Pennsylvania cases, that it goes back up afterwards. And now with Amy Coney Barrett, that you comes out with a different decision. I regard that as unlikely, but you know, it's possible. And one thing that they've been doing is trying to, that's the rationale behind the segregated ballots, so that you can't say that the whole election has been tainted, but just maybe some subsection of the ballots.
But Steve, if I just understand your question better, are you suggesting that the effect of any of these things would put a halt to all counting of absentee ballots after election day, including in the 18 states that allow it under the established law?
Well, I was wanting to make that very clarification, because there is a hint of that concern in the way this question was posed to us. And I do think it's important to know that it's only Pennsylvania's decision about extending the receipt deadline that's been at issue in that case. There are plenty of states that have existing state law that are not challenged at all. In fact, I think every state now already lets military and overseas ballots come back for some period of time after election day. And there's just no chance that the Supreme Court would, out of the blue, decide that there's some equal protection problem in counting those ballots that arrive after election day if they have otherwise complied with state law.
You know, I think this is kind of like the Trump Hail Mary, where he's saying he stopped the counting. He did this in 2018 as well in Florida, when Rick Scott was ahead in that narrow race between Scott and Nelson for the Florida Senate. I think he also made comments like this about Arizona, when McSally was ahead and ultimately lost to Sinema. And so he can gripe all he wants, and he can blame and say these ballots are full of fraud. But it's hard for me to see, putting aside Pennsylvania and North Carolina, where there's these existing legal disputes over these late arriving ballots. Of course, everyone's going to keep counting. You know, the reality is, everyone on the in this panel knows it, but maybe not everybody listening knows this, that we do not call races officially on election night. There's a whole process for certification. Every time that results are announced on election night, they're preliminary and tentative. Totals change, people make mistakes. They are estimates as to what the totals are going to be. There's going to be more counting. It's going to take weeks in many states. In California, where I live, it takes many weeks to go through all of the ballots. That doesn't mean that there's not enough information for the networks to make an unofficial projection about who the winner is, but the counting is going to continue. And I think people who are out there who are worried that because the president is saying we shouldn't count after election day, that that's actually something that's realistic, I don't think that's realistic. The only thing that's even in the realm of possibility is that in Pennsylvania or North Carolina or any other place where there has been a judicial extension of the deadline, that there might be some kind of legal mechanism to try to sequester those late arriving ballots and somehow treat them differently, not count them or something like that.
I want to jump in. I think Rick has it exactly right. And coming back also to this notion about, I think Charles was pointing out the flattening the curve, right? We already have a lot of ballots in. I think the number that's going to come in late is going to be small, despite all the Postal Service sort of concerns we have. And added to that, the one additional issue that's maybe more controversial in Pennsylvania is the notion that non-postmarked ballots received in the last 3 days will be presumptively treated as regular. And that's also, well, that's a concern. That's a vanishingly small number of ballots, right? When you're dealing with those things that arrive late, plus that lack the postmark. So I think it is careful. I think Rick does a great job sort of emphasizing that it's those sort of specific legal challenges. And even in those challenges, there's also nuances as we approach.
I want to add on to this point, because the Biden campaign has been very conservative about these issues all along, in the sense that They have not assumed that these lower court decisions on extension of these ballot deadlines will necessarily hold up on appeal. So it's not as if the campaign is suddenly shocked about this, or in Pennsylvania about the 3-day window maybe being in jeopardy. They have been for a long time, with their field operations in the states, telling voters to do various things to get ballots back early, but telling them to get them back by election day. So even in states where for a period of time there was an extended deadline, the campaign was still being very conservative about that. And so I agree with Derek. It may well be between how many people have already participated and the messaging that's gone out to voters who are more likely to use the absentee ballots, which we know, unfortunately, in my view, we know too much about which party's candidates are going to be stronger with absentees versus in-person voting. So we're not in the veil of ignorance. But the Biden campaign, I think, has been messaging on this well before these decisions. Just about the Supreme Court, my own view, which I'm certainly willing to say here, is I think the Supreme Court will ultimately decide that an action like the one of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court here is unconstitutional. That would be my prediction. There's a majority of the court, I believe, now that would take that view. But I would be really shocked if they were to apply that retroactively and say that in states like Pennsylvania, where they've allowed this to go forward, that suddenly they're going to turn around and kind of retroactively tell voters, sorry, you weren't actually allowed to do that. Now, there already seem to be a certain number of votes on the court to do that. But I will certainly be really shocked if there's a majority of the court that would actually come to that view, whatever they might do going forward on the substantive constitutional issue.
Steve, can I just jump in and focus on another aspect of the Pennsylvania situation that worries me? Because, and Rick Pildas and I were working on this issue some weeks ago when we were really trying to encourage the state legislature as much as we could in op-eds and so forth to move the date forward, as many people wanted, election officials around the state, the Secretary of State, to allow for the pre-processing of absentee ballots so they're not just piling up and can't be touched until election day. That change did not happen. And so we don't yet know what the challenge process is going to look like, as candidates may attempt to look and see whether or not absentee ballots lack signatures or have other problems like the naked ballot issue or what have you. The Philadelphia Inquirer today, I believe, has a new story on how localities, despite the fact that the statute says you can't look at them before election day, are trying to start to peak in order to give their voters an opportunity to cure potential defects. But there's county by county variation in terms of how this is going. I don't know if that county by county variation creates a Bush versus Gore type equal protection problem on local differentiation of similar ballots. I think less important than that technical issue is just that we won't know, I don't think, until 7 a.m. on election day, what the verification of absentee ballots in Pennsylvania looks like. Whereas that's already happening in Florida and in Ohio and a bunch of other states. And so if all eyes end up being on Pennsylvania, this whole verification process, I think, comes to light. So it's not just the 3-day window that we've been talking about that concerns me. It's the entirety of the review of the absentee ballots. Am I overly concerned about this? When I talk to folks, people, and Nate, maybe this is to you, when I talk to people on the ground in Pennsylvania a month or so ago, my judgment was that they were not adequately prepared for how this challenge process would actually unfold. You may be talking to people more recently and have a better sense that they've got this under control.
Well, the Secretary of State has issued guidance on when challenges are permitted and when they're not, and you should expect there, in the event of a close election, that guidance will be challenged, and we really don't know what the actions are going to be inside the polling places or even after the ballots are cast. And this applies to mail ballots, applies to provisional ballots, right? That there could be all kinds of disputes over that if it's a close election, and so I wouldn't say they're prepared for that. But they are now prepared for the rush of, given the statutory and other constraints, they are prepared as best as possible to process those absentee ballots over the succeeding few days, right? So 6 months ago, some of these places didn't even have the mail ballot extractors and sorters. They would have had to do it by hand, right? Now, it depends, what your baseline is here. And the baseline was pretty low in Philadelphia and some other places. And they've now acquired some of the necessary equipment, brought in people to help out with that. But it will take several days because of the statutory limits as to when they can start processing absentee ballots.
But isn't it going to take a lot longer than several days if ballots are challenged, right? I mean, it'll take several days if there's no challenges. But if, and I'm not talking to either campaigns. I don't know what their strategies are. But if any campaign comes in and says, we want to challenge a bunch of ballots all around the state of Pennsylvania, those are the local officials are going to have to go through that review of the challenge process. And then people have talked about the weaknesses of Pennsylvania law. My judgment is Pennsylvania law is particularly weak in this regard in terms of the capacity for delay with respect to these challenges.
That is possible, but you can't just say, I challenge all absentee ballots, right? So there's a process that has to go forward about, identifying causes here. And so, for example, signature mismatches, at least right now under the Secretary of State's guidance, are not allowed to be the independent reason you're going to disqualify ballots. You have to explain why you think this person is not who they say they are, right? Or that they are an ineligible voter. And so you can't just make a blanket challenge to all the ballots. You're going to have to figure. Now, it still may happen. There are all kinds of ways to delay the counting through these challenges, and I wouldn't be surprised if that does happen. But there is a legal process that's going to have to proceed if they've got people who are if the campaigns are challenging voters for one reason or another.
So
applies to the polling places too, right? You can actually, under Pennsylvania law, you can challenge voters' eligibility in the polling place. That then puts the poll workers in particular positions, right, to adjudicate these challenges on the fly. They're going to have to make decisions about whether they give provisional ballots or not, right? But if someone is just there trying to slow up the process, there are ways of dealing with that.
So all of this is reminding me that right off the top, Franita described one of her top of the mind concerns as being election night, we would still not have a result. And this is exactly one way that might be true. I'm wondering, Franita, what your reflections on the conversation we've just been having might be and how it relates to where you started today.
I think I'm dismayed by the framing. I think it's exactly right. Like, I agree with Rick Pildas about how the court will probably come down with respect to the independent state legislature doctrine. But so much of the conversation is about this competition or the relationship between the state legislature and the state courts. But very little thought is given to the voters. And it just makes me realize that, to put it succinctly, is the right to vote our law anymore? And to what extent is that part of the equation here? Right? We're talking about these issues and thinking about these issues in terms of what the state legislature can do and how much the state court can constrain them. But it's important to understand, at least to me, that the state court was trying to constrain them with respect to what the state court believed the right to vote required under the Pennsylvania Constitution. So the U.S. Supreme Court gets around that by saying that the state legislature cannot be constrained by the state constitution. But there's also a federal constitution. There's also a right to vote under the federal constitution. And it just seems to me that constitutional principles about the right to vote broadly defined, regardless if it's under state or federal law. And I understand that the Pennsylvania decision might not have teed up this issue in the same way under the federal constitution, but it still is striking to me how much of this conversation about Pennsylvania and North Carolina is taking place in the context of the relationship, really the power struggle between the various organs of the state. And we're not, and not we on this call, but more so the courts generally are not thinking about the right to vote and how that is a constraint as well. And one striking example of this is in Kavanaugh's opinion, he talks about this notion of the independent state legislature doctrine as being as sort of Trump and Anderson Burdick, right? Like he mentions Anderson Burdick, it comes up, right? This balancing test of balancing the benefits of the burdens of a regulation versus the benefits of a regulation versus the burden on the right to vote. But he's already reached his conclusion in, you know, his analysis of the state legislature not being able to be constrained by the state constitution. And so it's like the right to vote has really become irrelevant. And it makes me wonder if it's, you know, is this just the reality that we live in, where the right to vote is just not a constraint anymore? It's not a consideration, it's not a concern. Instead, it's about which organ of the state is best situated in order to implement these regulations independent of one another without consideration of the voters. And I just find that very dismaying. It seems like the framing has completely shifted.
Thanks, Franita.
So I wonder.
Yeah, go ahead, Rebecca. Yep.
I was just going to say, you know, I wonder, as I'm listening to Franita, I share her concerns, especially about, you know, this boiling down to a power struggle between institutions that doesn't involve voters. But I do wonder how much of the Supreme Court's jurisprudence, you know, in the last month or so really relates to like operating an election in a pandemic, and whether it's fair or possible to expand, you know, there are people, for example, talking about the demise of the Anderson Burdick test. And I just wonder whether once the dust has settled, you know, some of these debates will fade away and we might return to a more normal weighing of benefits and burdens or interests and burdens.
I don't think so. I don't think that it will go away. Right. I think that may be the legacy of this time, because essentially the Supreme Court is prioritizing the pre-COVID baseline, right, and saying that the state legislature is unconstrained and state courts are limited in, well, some justices respect to state courts, but even federal courts are limited in their ability to impose remedies under the auspices of vindicating the right to vote. If anything, you would think that the remedial authority of the courts will be broader here because of COVID, but the Supreme Court seems to think that the pre-COVID baseline is the one that should predominate. And so to me, it seems easy to carry that on moving forward, as opposed to the court being more flexible now and saying that COVID demanded that there be some accommodations in order for voters to be able to more easily cast a ballot, but they're just simply not doing that. To me, that says a lot about how the court views the robustness of the right to vote, and that, you know, it's just not a constraint anymore at all.
So Rick Hassan and then Rick Pildas.
So this was just to respond to Rebecca about Anderson Burdick generally, which is this balancing test that courts apply, where the greater the burden, the higher the scrutiny the court applies to a state rule. I think, you know, it's easy to lose sight of how much anti-voter law has been made by the federal appellate courts in the last few months in responding to these challenges. I think Democrats and voting rights groups were very aggressive in trying to seek COVID-related changes. They were very successful in district courts. They had mixed success and weak success, especially as we got closer to the election in the federal appeals courts. But just a couple of the Fifth Circuit rulings on and also, since this is an Ohio State event, some of the Sixth Circuit rulings suggesting that Anderson Burdick, we should go to Justice Scalia's test, which is a much less voter-friendly test. That even if you're going to use Anderson Burdick, you shouldn't do it the way it's been done. More of a light switch rather than a dimmer switch. More of if it doesn't burden most voters, then you can't have as applied challenges. I think going forward in the judiciary, voting rights is not going to get as strong a protection as it has been getting, which it hasn't even been great from the point of view of the voter. I think things are going to get much, much worse. And I think the real clash that's going to come if in fact Biden wins the election and Democrats take both houses of Congress and blow up the filibuster for purposes of election reform, is there's going to be some version of HR 1 passed. There's going to be some massive effort to try to solve some of these problems legislatively, using Congress's power under the Elections Clause and using Congress's power to enforce the voting rights amendments. And that's going to set up a major clash with the Supreme Court. And the really kind of the future of voting rights is for the medium term is going to depend upon how that battle would go.
So let me just observe. Oh, I'm sorry, Rick Pildas, you were also going to.
Yeah, well, I just also want to step back from focusing so much on the courts. I understand why, as law professors, we tend to do that. As Rick Hazen also mentioned, there were some lawyers who thought this election is going to be won in the courts. And that always seemed to me a somewhat exaggerated view of the role the courts would play one way or the other. But to come back to what Nate and Charles were saying at the beginning, there have been dramatic changes to the voting process that have been made because of the pandemic. And those changes have come overwhelmingly through state legislatures or governors through executive orders. So, step back and remember the issues we were concerned about in the spring and the summer. We were concerned about whether voters would have the option to vote by mail for any reason at all. 45 states now have allowed every voter to vote by mail for whatever reason they want. 45 states. There were 11 states that expanded that policy. A majority of those actually were under Republican control. 6 were Republican control, 5 were Democratically controlled. Number 2, there has been dramatic expansion of access to early voting. So states like Kentucky, which had 0 days of early voting, through bipartisan agreement there, has 3 weeks of early voting. Even Texas, which has been in the courts over and over again and in the national news as a result of that, even Texas, the governor there expanded early voting by nearly a week. So Texas has now about 2.5 weeks of early voting. He actually did it over the objections, by the way, of the state Republican Party, which took him to court and lost. And you are seeing the results of all of this right now, even before Election Day. As people know, if you're reading the papers, the vote in Texas now is 95% of what it was by the end of the election in 2016. And that is almost all early voting. 90% of it is early voting, taking advantage of these expanded early voting periods. So, yes, there are definitely issues to worry about, and these issues that are getting fought about in the courts. We're also fixated on the possibility that a tiny margin could determine everything. And if that's true, some of these court decisions could make a difference. But in the big picture scheme of things, we have tremendous access and participation that voters have been taking advantage of already for several weeks. And all the projections are we're going to have the highest turnout election since 1908, which is even more remarkable because we're post the amendment that lowered the voting age to 18, where since then turnout has always been even lower because younger people don't vote at high rates. They are coming out in huge rates this year. And so, yes, it's worth talking about what's going on in the courts and trying to anticipate the Supreme Court's next moves. But as Nate said at the beginning, let's step back and not lose perspective on the big picture here and where we are and where we've come since the pandemic first broke and we all began to start being extremely worried about how we would conduct an election during the time of COVID-19.
I do think that we could walk and chew gum. So I agree with that completely. I do think that we have to look at the big picture. But I think a part of me gets tired of congratulating state officials for doing what they're supposed to do. You're supposed to make it easier to vote in a pandemic to me. It's become sort of this big partisan, fight where people are trying to gain advantages. And most often you see changes in states that, really don't matter. And then you see some changes in states, but it's like they give with one hand and they take away with the other. For example, in Texas, there were positive changes made. I agree completely, but then with the one drop box per county, and you got one drop box in Harris County, which is the size of Rhode Island, it's just kind of like, wow. And so, you know, I just find it's hard for me because state officials should be in the business of making it easier for people to vote. And that is a very important part of the narrative. And I actually welcome those reminders because I know I am in a full blown panic. But at the same time, I think we have to get to we have to get to a place where our norm is that when things happen, state officials can respond and it doesn't become this huge partisan fight where people are trying to seek advantage. And we're definitely not there. And that's the part that I just find very infuriating.
So let me ask us to shift gears. We don't have much time left, but there are several questions that have come in that are about election day and social media related, and the idea of witness or monitors, observers showing up in large numbers around the country, and what kind of government response that might or should produce. So what do we think at this point we might realistically expect to see on Tuesday? Of course, Tuesday is not particularly or not especially important given that we've been doing so much early voting, right? But still, there's a bit of a focus on Tuesday. And what kind of response should occur through social media or through official actors? So let me turn back to you as it relates to what you had described as one of your principal focuses when we began today.
Was that me? I didn't quite hear.
Lisa.
Lisa.
Sorry.
Oh, thanks. So I'm not sure if I have a great answer to that in particular, but I guess what I would say is just to sort of pull on some of the themes of what we've been talking about thus far, which is to say that these elections are complicated. There's a lot of different moving parts. A lot of the really controversial stuff, there's not necessarily a clear answer one way or the other on the law, and certainly on the facts, that there can be sort of different ways of understanding things. And so as much as we all want information really fast, and really definitively, if you see information that's coming at you really fast and it seems really certain, ironically, in a sense, that's maybe the least reliable information that you're going to be seeing on election day. So I, for one, my job requires me to be following what's going on in election day, but if my job did not require me to do that, I personally would not be following what's going on election day at all. I would take the day off and go to the hills, which I suspect that all of us on the call would probably like to be able to do that right now.
Nate, I know you've been quite involved in thinking about social media and its impact.
So the companies are doing some unprecedented things this time. And I'll say that, you know, while there's certainly plenty of disinformation that's out there, and we should be particularly vigilant and concerned about it after the polls close, it's not as if they are not thinking about it and they are throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. And so, and they're getting in trouble for it, as you could see, was the CEOs of Facebook, Twitter, and Google when they were raked over the coals at Capitol Hill yesterday. So there are, you know, they're walking a tightrope here, but they're doing several things, which is first, on the vote suppressive messaging, they're doing what they can to demote or otherwise take down some of that messaging. But also, you'll notice that they're trying to flood the zone with good information and to amplify the voices of election officials. So if you look at the Facebook's Voting Information Center, as well as the top of feed notifications that people have been getting, almost everybody I know is getting these voting reminders at the top, and those reminders change every day. Sometimes it'll be about registration, maybe about mail balloting, about finding your polling place, that type of stuff. And then on election day itself, the Voting Information Center will change, and they will, once the polls close, start dealing with the issue of amplifying respected sources when it comes to the calls on election day. They've also, both Facebook and Twitter, have promised not to allow for false claims of victory until there are reputable sources that have declared states. And so that does mean that they are deferring to Reuters and some of the decision desks, but you will be able to see in the Voting Information Center information on which networks have called which states for which candidate.
I want to jump into I think there's been a lot of concerns about voter intimidation, about riots, about armed, folks sort of roaming the polling places, or that somehow, partisans are just going to show up unannounced to be observers at polling locations. I mean, so far, by and large, there's been a lot of early voting and lots of opportunities for that, and it's been pretty quiet, right? It's not completely quiet like in any place. But so far, I think the signs have been good. And I think, state secretaries of state and county officials are aware that there's potentially going to be people showing up on election day that want to sort of just be looky-loos and see what's going on. And they say that's not the process we have here. If you want to be an observer, you register. And to be frank, I think the parties want a little bit of control too over who's sort of showing up, and that's not random people in the name of the party. So I think these are things that, again, secretaries of state have been thinking about for a long time and are providing that guidance at the local level. I mean, to the extent that precinct officers have to call the police, it's an unfortunate incident, but I think it's something that is actively being prepared for ahead of election day.
I think that there's a lot of concern about rogue actors, as opposed to, I gave a lot of interviews early on about the end of the consent decree. So far, it doesn't appear that the Trump campaign is actually doing all that much out of the ordinary from what ordinary poll observation is. We'll see. Their training videos are pretty standard, if a little bit incendiary. But I'm worried about the rogue actors, and I'm more worried about something Rick Pildas mentioned earlier, which is seeing reports of the rogue actor somewhere in some place. And then that becomes the top of the news, kind of like how the new Black Panthers became an issue for years, that you could take a single incident and it becomes emblematic of the election. And I think that's one of the big challenges, to go back to Nate's point about how social media companies deal with election day, because there's going to be that grainy video of the vote flip on the voting machine or something else that's going to trigger the elections being stolen, and lots of misinformation, not even necessarily intentional disinformation, but the anecdote that becomes the lead story. And I think the media and social media companies have to be really careful about that.
Just kind of going back to an earlier point Rick just made, I feel like there's a potential silver lining to the voter intimidation narrative that we've seen in so many headlines over the last couple of months, which is that it may in fact have driven so much early voting in large part. I know a lot of people around here have taken part in early voting to avoid concerns about nastiness on election day. So to some extent, I guess that's a potential silver lining to that kind of messaging.
So in the few minutes we have left, at least one thing I would be interested, and I know others on our panel are interested in this as well, and it's something that a couple of the questions that have been submitted by the audience relate to, is sort of the place of the legal system in a deeply contested election. And we've touched on this already. We've talked about how it could ultimately become really a matter of political power, not law, that resolves the election and so forth. But it invites us all to think about the place of law here and how resilient the legal system is, and what role there is for the legal system to help the country then accept the result. I'm just curious whether that line of questioning triggers any thoughts from any of you.
I hope the election can be resolved with no more court intervention, that it's not close, and that, I think we all, if we have a few minutes left, we should actually end with a silent prayer. That it doesn't come down to Pennsylvania. I think, even in this diverse group, we could all probably agree on some kind of ecumenical approach to that.
I'll make a point about the courts. One of the bizarre features of how the American legal system works is that our courts won't address uncertain issues about the meaning of critical statutes, like those regulating the election, until there's a live case or controversy, as law students listening to this know. And in the context of a disputed election, that's the worst possible situation for the courts to put themselves in, because At that moment, everybody knows which candidate's going to benefit or be damaged by a ruling, including the judges. And whether or not the judges are acting in good faith and doing their best to apply the law, the losing side is inevitably going to believe, especially in this moment, that the judges have acted for partisan reasons. In many other legal systems and in some state courts, you can get the courts to issue what are called advisory opinions, and to clarify the law in advance of an actual live dispute. So they don't know who will be hurt or who will be benefited by the ruling. Now, there's, I'm sure, nothing we can do about that because this idea is so deeply embedded in American legal doctrine. But it is a perversity, or at least it has perverse consequences, is maybe a better way to put it, in the context of things like the most contentious issues, such as the resolution of a disputed election, particularly for an institution like the presidency.
Lisa?
Yeah, to circle back to our discussion before regarding the right to vote. So the right to vote, most of the rights that we have vis-a-vis the government are negative rights, which is to say, you know, my freedom of speech right, it's the right to not have the government interfere with my speech, or my freedom to not be subject to unreasonable searches and seizures. That's my right to be free of the government doing that to me. By contrast, when it comes to the right to vote, that's not a negative right. It's not the case that I can exercise that vote so long as the government leaves me alone. Instead, the government actually has to facilitate my right to vote. And one of the problems that we have here that we've been talking about is that not all the people in charge of, by far, not all the people in charge of facilitating my right to vote are executing that responsibility in a way that's problematic. But a large number of the people at this point who are in charge of the way we structure our voting systems seem to, at worst, be actually affirmatively trying to make it harder for voters to vote. And at best, in some ways, they are not changing things or supporting the system in a way that is necessary to facilitate people's voting. So in my view, I'm hoping and expecting that the country makes it through this upcoming election, but I do not think that this is sustainable in a democracy, and we do need some change when it comes to the basic way that over the last 10 plus years, the direction that the country has been going in terms of facilitating this right to vote. So that's indirectly related to the question you just asked, Stephen, but I think it circles back to the right to vote more generally, which we talked about earlier.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. It does. And you know, when we think about the contribution of the legal system, it has to be not just what the courts themselves might do in a dispute. It has to be what the law on the ground is that our administrators are following. And I will say, as a kind of closing point here, that there are many people who are part of our panel today who have already been thinking quite a bit about just what we learned from this election that might inform the way in which we try to do more to protect that right, whether it's through a constitutional amendment. I think Ned and Fernita have been talking about that in their podcasts, for instance, and other revisions or new versions of a Voting Rights Act or so forth. So there's lots of room for the legal system to grow from this election. So we have reached the end of our time together, and I want to first apologize to those people who asked questions that we just couldn't get to, and this is such a rich discussion. It could have gone on for hours if we all had time to get to all those questions. But then to really conclude, let me just offer the appreciation of the election law program here at Ohio State to each of you for being with us today, and then the election officials' prayer that Rick made mention to before. Let this not be a close election. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been great. Appreciate it.
Yes. Indeed. I just want to quickly echo my thanks to all of you and to Steve for moderating us. Good luck. Be well, everybody. Take care.